It's a couple minutes after 5:30. I think we'll get started in just a minute. Just welcome to the Rojan Library. If you're new here, I'm Tammy Gaskell. I'm the director here. We're delighted to have Peter Wainwright join us. Wainwright. Why did I say that?
They made the cars.
Yeah, you made the wheels. Peter Wheelwright joined us today to discuss his latest novel, The Doorman, which a lot of people have been asking for. I know we've been getting a lot of requests in the library because I guess not only are you a great writer, but it's a local story. So people are interested in reading about local history in novel form, apparently. So I am going to turn it over to Peter. He will take questions during the talk. Just raise your hand if you want to interrupt. We have plenty of time for questions at the end. I am recording this, so we will post it on our website afterwards. So if you want to come back and look at it or share it with any of your friends, you're able to do that. So I will turn it over to Peter.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Tammy, for inviting me. So what I thought I would do tonight, I don't know how many of you read the book, how many of you tried to read the book, struggled with the book. I'm going to give you first a little backstory on sort of the stuff that inspired the story, and then I'm going to do three very brief readings from the book, and you'll sort of see the logic of it. Please come in. I suspect. So I have 16 images that are going to give you a little bit of the backstory. Yeah, this is the blur from roughly the back of the book. Let's see if I can. So it's a multi-generational story inspired by the unusual fossil discovery in 1917 at the dune mountain town of Gilboa, New York, during construction of a reservoir for New York City's water system. It's narrated by a New York City doorman in 1993 who works near the newly decommissioned Central Park Reservoir. The novel traces the consequences across 3 generations of the flooded town, the patronized woman who made the fossil identification, and the violence that occurred in this clash of nature and the city. And I'm showing this genealogy chart, quote unquote. It's in the beginning of the book, and there are a lot of dramatis personae in this story, and because it runs across 3 generations, and to make it even more complicated for you, some of the characters' names changed during the course of the book. So this is your lifeline, unless you're one of these people who goes traveling to Europe without reading the tour books before you go, so you can simply be there then. Those are the two. There are some who cleave to this, and there are others who just read the book and pray to God that it all congeals at the end. And apparently, for most people, it does. So the story is also about trees. And a reminder of the botanical explosion of oxygen that cleared the evolutionary path of lunged creatures, including us, humankind. I was writing this book, deep into this book, when Richard Powers' The Overstory came out, and everybody was raving about it, and I couldn't go near it because I knew it would compromise what I was trying to do here. So, the first generation, this is the town of Gilboa in this lovely little Schoharie Valley. That's the Schoharie Creek running there, and keep your eye on that steeple. Because in 1916, There's that steeple. Gilboa is engulfed by New York. And this is to supply New York City's water system. And by way of the Catskill Reservoir, this water ends up in the Central Park Reservoir. So there's this hook between the doorman in 93 and sort of the fate of this town. But then what happens the following year is there's a discovery in these fossils in the Gilboa Riverside Quarry. And these are the stumps of a tree from a vast forest that was flooded by the Catskill Sea 350 to 400 million years ago. And the discovery was so extraordinary because it was the oldest remnant of an ancient forest in the world at the time of its discovery. So suddenly you had this town that on the one hand, doesn't quite understand the technological and political power of New York City, other than it's, going to prove fatal to them. But nor do they really understand science, other than it offers the breath of life. That's what really intrigued me, was the town was caught between these two things. They just wanted to survive. So this held out hope, because the international science community was just astounded by the discovery, and they stopped construction on the dam. And for a very brief moment, they thought the town would be saved. And this is the protagonist, Winifred Goldring, of the book. She was a paleontologist up in the New York State Albany Museum in a highly male, fully male department of paleontology. And she was patronized for being, a woman who, was in a man's field. But as you could see, she had a lot of character. And this is actually her drawing of the Gilboa tree based on the fossilized stuff. So she was the one who, by kind of fortitude, insistence, got down to Gilboa to make the actual identification. And she features very centrally in the story. But she's not able to save the town. As you can see, this is the Schoharie Reservoir, and that's where, that was where that church steeple, somewhere under that water. Stone walls and old foundations still showed up in low water and submerged property lines. Places of the heart had become stories told with pointed fingers and wistful faces reflected on the surface of the still reservoir pools. The taking line is a chapter in the book, and the taking line refers to the line that the surveyors strike across the rolling hillside, which is topographically very complex, but their line is perfectly straight because it represents where the water will rise and flow over the dam. That's the taking line. So, but Winifred does manage. Her identification of the fossils proves to be exceptional, and she goes on to an amazing career. And this is a real woman, a real paleontologist. She went on to become, in fact, the president of the American Paleontological Society, first woman, largest society of paleontologists in the world. So she had a very robust career based on her work. And this is a diorama that she had fabricated and installed, working with the diorama experts, the Marchand brothers, who did all the dioramas in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. So she worked with them, and these are stones from Gilboa. But because the tree really wasn't a tree in the sense that we understand trees now, it was actually more related to ferns. So they shipped up from Princeton, Florida, ferns that got waxed and shellacked and, would replace the ferns of the diorama, which takes us to the second generation down in Florida. And the second generation takes place down in Sebring, Florida, and also in Princeton. And it's centered on the Civilian Conservation Corps, which many of you, I'm sure, know about back in the Roosevelt days. The young men of the civilian, they worked hard in parks, building trails and so forth, and planting trees in Florida, particularly around the Everglades, which had been really raped by development and clear cut right down to the red dust dirt. So they went down to the Florida group in Highlands Hammock, did tree planting down there, and that's where the Winifred Goldring's son ends up. So there they are planting trees and so forth. And then there is a kidnapping that takes place in Princeton, Florida. And if you Google kidnapping Princeton, Florida, 1930s, you will read about the kidnapping of Bailey Cash. In the book, he's different. He has a different name and so forth, but I'm playing again. This is factual fiction, this book. You know, the first generation is very much about facts. The second and third generations are fiction. But they're all based on real events that happened. So the young guys from the CCC were bivouacked, and there were hundreds of them brought there to search for the kidnapped child. Which takes us now to the third generation, the doorman. And this is the grandson, who works on, and is also the narrator of the book. And he works on Central Park West, sort of right in this area. That's where the State Urban is. It's a real building. And you can just get a glimpse of the Central Park Reservoir. So he spends his time at the door, but he's really more interested in what's happening in Central Park, and particularly the reservoir, because there is a curious discovery of a lungfish in the North Basin. This is fiction. And that's what sets the whole story in motion. That's the North and South basins of the Central Park Reservoir, and a lungfish is spotted in there. And the significance of the lungfish is that it is what they call a living fossil. Its ancestor from the Devonian period basically looked exactly like that. So that sort of sets the whole story in motion, which then takes the doorman back to Gilboa and to Shem's finger break. And you'll have to read the book to know more about Shem's finger break. So that's sort of the backstory. I love this little epigraph from a letter from Charles Darwin to Alfred Wallace from 1857. You ask whether I shall discuss man. I think I shall avoid the whole subject as so surrounded with prejudice, though I fully admit that it is the highest and most interesting problem for the naturalist. So that's the epigraph that goes with this drawing by Winifred Goldring. So that's the end of that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read a short passage from each of the generations. I'm going to start with the first generation, the doorman. And I'm happy to take questions in between. And if you have any questions so far, I know that's a story unto itself, what I just did. But
how many people lived in Gilboa before they started?
it was a fairly thriving little, rural town. It had 2 or 3 hotels. It had, a lot of mills. There was a real business there because it was on the road across to Ohio, which during that, the early part of the 1800s, once the Northeast farms were, denuded and the rich agricultural land of the Midwest opened up. it was right on the, on that crossroad. So it was quite a busy little town. I mean, it had its own newspaper and. Okay, so. I'm gonna read, there's a prologue in the book, and then it goes to chapter 1, which is entitled The Third, Piedmont Livingston Consolver, the Third, 1993, the St. Urban, New York City. Speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee. Job 12:8. Consolver, that is how I am called. It does not sound like my name when they greet me. It has an offhand ring to it, as if we all know that it's not really me that is being greeted. Rather, it is our business together that is being addressed. Most mean well. I smile and nod. They smile back. I lean away and take hold of the handle. The door swings. The light bounces off the polished brass and refracts through the glass. The reflections from Central Park sweep with it, flickering shards of impressionistic landscapes. Thank you, Consolver, they say, leaving my name at the door. I retrieve it, my surname, carrying it back in time to the patriarchs. I can't blame them. This is how it should be and how I want it. No further address is required. After all, they live here at the St. Urban. I am only a doorman, one of many along Central Park West. No one suspects that it is my considered choice. Dante, the young boy from the East Penthouse, calls me the doorman, pulling apart the compound lexeme, no indefinite article or lowercase for him. It was the boys downstairs neighbor Delano DeAngelis who put this idea in his head. Although DeAngelis has just turned 40 and Dante is only 9, they're friends. Del, as he is called, is like a much older half-brother from a father's earlier marriage, a half-brother that actually gives more than a half shit about their shared blood. In the beginning, it was a joke between the three of us, the doorman. Sometimes I will even respond in kind by calling Dante the altar boy, which in fact is an accurate moniker for him, particularly most Sundays when he's up the street at the Church of the Immaculate Conception. But lately there seems to be a more urgent emphasis in Dante's tone. I'm not quite sure what is up with this, but neither am I inclined to ask, not yet, at least. I am good at my job, doorman, my very being coupled with a plane of glass and a set of hinges. I appreciate that in many ways I am interchangeable with the door itself, that it affords me a kind of invisibility, a way to observe comings and goings without being noticed myself. But it's also what I like to call the medieval thing, the business of being identified by, well, by your business, literally, what you do on earth rather than how you got there. Mr. Smith, a metal worker. Thatcher, a woven straw roofer. Baker, yes, mincemeat pie. The medieval thing, no soul-sucking scheme of parenting surnames necessary. Even the plants growing on the earth were named for their avocations, for their work on behalf of mankind. The doctrine of signatures, curing our bodies, our organs, our bones, liverwort, eyebright, skullcap, bloodroot, bleeding heart, the earth's bounty ground up in a stone crucible and applied to our flesh and credulous souls. Of course, we were all on God's watch then. All souls belong to him, the only free will, his. Faith was truth, modern science was centuries away, and our Father who art in heaven had not yet been dismissed as a, quote, gaseous invertebrate, unquote, from Ernst Haeckel's laboratory. When I was a younger man, I was taught quite a few things about life on Earth. I'm still in the grip of those lessons. This morning, in the wake of last night's dream, I've taken up my position at the door of the St. Urban, uniform perfectly pressed, eyes forward, hands clasped behind my back, rocking ever so slightly on my feet. Like a pikeman at the portcullis, I face across the avenue into Central Park, surveying my surroundings. To the south, the turrets of the Museum of Natural History. To the east, above the trees, the sawtooth skylights of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And to the north, the great cathedral where young Dante is a server, the Church of the Immaculate Conception. Yes, the medieval thing. Perhaps I would have been happier then, before the earth had revealed its true nature, and science and art and religion were not strangers to one another, but rather one and the same. Their faint borders, indistinct within a wholly aesthetic alchemy. Of course, there is no going back once when one understands in the depths of their being that nothing remains. That since the beginning, the earth has been ruptured and folded many times over, along with everything that has attempted to take hold on its fragile surface. When I look into Central Park, I can't help but see all of this, the nature of things, the wheeling of the spheres above, the changes of season and light, the landscape's deference to rain and wind, and the modest wildlife that finds a home on its temporary shape-shifting ground. Perhaps that is why I spend as much time as possible tending to the verdant humming of the park, tending to the door of the St. Urban behind me, the secondary. Today, as is typical of this time of year, the rising sun is shielded by a tall line of old dogwoods, oaks, and lindens standing sentinel along the brownstone wall separating Central Park from the city. Heavy limbs, thick with summer leaves, reach over the wall, mottling the sidewalk with shade. I note the green as I imagine my grandmother Winifred once did. The photosynthetic absorption of the chlorophyll, swallowing up the colors of the spectrum, all but the green, the sun and the leaves, the sun and the leaves. It begins there. She had known this well in ancient nature, in the aboriginal sunlight, the slow taking up of carbon dioxide and transpiration of water, the release of oxygen molecules, and then the breath of life. The botanical explosion of forests that filled the atmosphere with air high above the Acadian orogeny and Pangaea's lonely drift in the Panthalassic Sea. Life in the garden, the very possibility of science, art, and religion, the very possibility of this city, of this park, of this witness. A sudden tight burst of reflected sunlight fires through the trees, skipping off the surface of the Central Park Reservoir like a smooth stone. I can see only a small silver sliver of the water from my post, only what a brief parting in the leaves allows. It grabs my attention, reminding me that there was a time when Central Park was better known for its position in the space of the city than for its pride of place. It was simply a, quote, central, unquote, park, easy to locate, and in its own center, Lake Mannahatta, the city's drinking water, a reservoir filled from distant watersheds. That is yet another history coming to an end. The reservoir has been decommissioned, the pumps are off, valves shut, and no one is drinking its water any longer. No humans, at least. Still, if history has taught us anything, it is that each ending had its beginnings. It's only a matter of how far back one goes to find it. That's the first generation. That's your introduction to the doorman. Any questions so far? Well, now, if you ever go to New York City, you go to Central Park West, you just go on up to 285 and take a photograph of the St. Urban and see who the doorman is. So I'm going to go from the third generation, introducing Kinsolver, to the first generation, to his grandmother, Winifred Goldring, who I introduced you to earlier. And this little bit is after the fossils have been discovered in the quarry and the New York State Museum in Albany has been notified about it. And the head of the museum, James Clark, was a real character, is trying to figure out who to send down to Gilboa to make the identification. And this piece here give you a sense of how and why the man from the museum turned out to be Winifred Goldring. It had been difficult for Winifred, Clapp's, quote, man from the museum, unquote, to get there. The tight confines of Piedmont's sidecar had been the easy part. You remember that photograph of her motorcycle. When word of the discovery at the dam site arrived at the State Museum in Albany, Winifred Goldring was hopeful that she'd be sent to Gilboa to verify the find and collect samples. She knew the stratum where they'd been found. It was her geological period, Devonian. Winifred had been at the museum for 6 years, attached to what some of her colleagues referred to as, quote, the garden club, unquote. The director of the State Museum was a friend of her father's and had reluctantly taken her on to fill an empty niche in the paleontology department. Botany, flowers and plants, the ancient ones. She was the first woman on the scientific staff and a gamble. 2 degrees in the sciences from Wellesley College, a master's thesis in geological morphology guided by the Harvard faculty, and a year at Johns Hopkins studying late Silurian and Devonian period flora looked impressive on a man's resume, but not on a woman's. Science work just wasn't very feminine, nor from the point of view of some of her colleagues was she. The previous year, Winifred had been promoted, quote unquote, to assistant to the assistant state paleontologist. Her title had no precedence. Everyone knew it had been conferred on her simply to keep her quiet. There had been no advancement in either responsibility or pay. She expected that. She knew she was lucky to have the job at all. But she also knew that she was more than an assistant. Anyone who suggested otherwise met with a whiplash tongue and was soon in retreat. Fred, as she was called behind her back, even by some of the timorous women who actually were assistants, was considered to have, quote, a man's turn of mind, unquote. This had originally been meant as a compliment during her schooling into the profession. But it had taken, this had originally been meant as a compliment during her schooling in paleontology, but it had taken a sarcastic turn when she took her schooling into the profession. Mastering the physical universe was just that, the work of masters, not mistresses. She had heard it all her young life. The predictive sciences, physics and chemistry where mankind's future was being determined were not for women. Womankind had no aptitude for the required mathematics and logical inference. Cool precision, not easily heated passion was necessary in the laboratory. Rolled up sleeves, not long skirts and dewy emotions. Even in biological and anatomical research, putrescent organs were unseemly and delicate hands meant for holding children. But it was worse in Winifred's chosen field of science, the science that looked backwards in time to understand the present. Hunting for the origins of life meant rough travel around the Earth's lithic sphere in search of rough rock faces and the minute markings of fossils embedded in titanic holes, far beyond civilization, far beyond a woman's safety. But Winifred Goldring had always had a formidable and fearless mind, and she was insistent when it came to the Gilboa fossils. She'd heard that Gilboa was a particularly disorderly civilization with its roughneck clash of nations, dispirited and dark-minded locals, and the relentless mayhem of machines ripping apart the ground beneath them all. Still, she could take care of herself, as she had always done. When Winifred came to work and displayed her father's black powder frame Colt 45 to the director as a means of reassuring him, he felt only embarrassment for her and tried to put her off. Field work, he said, is dangerous, especially for girls in knickers. It's all right for a man to make the trip, but a girl, even armed with a revolver, never. The director had intended his remark kindly, but he was serious. The men, when they could be spared, would be sent to Gilboa instead. She held her ground, standing over him with folded arms as he sat at his desk. Perhaps it was the way she held the gun, confident and relaxed in one hand, nestled into the crook of her elbow, or just that he couldn't bear to stare down the steel in her eyes. He finally gave in. It would be unpaid leave. She'd have to make her own way and find her own lodging. That was fine with her. She had a sister in Gilboa, and she felt it was payment enough to get there ahead of the man, which she did. And that's Winifred Goldring. And the dialogue in that little exchange with the director is actually taken from Winifred's letters. I had access to all of her papers in the New York State Museum and read all of her correspondences. And that comment that the director made was actually there. And she did carry a gun. She was really quite a fearless character.
So what were her dates?
She was born, I think, you'll have to, she died in 71 in real life. In my book, she dies not in 71, but she was born, I think, in 1898, maybe. Yeah, Winifred Goldring.
What drew you to the story?
Well, you saw the slide presentation.
Yeah.
You know, actually, that's a good question. What does anybody know? Ever heard of the Catskill geologist Robert Titus?
Yeah.
Yes.
He's a professor at Hardwick, and you know, he used to write little articles about geology in the local paper, the Rojan Independent, back in the day when the Rojan Independent was around, and he occasionally pops up in Columbia paper as well. And he has a blog, and he and his wife, you know, they're the go-to folks for geology around this area. And it was one of his articles about Gilboa in the Rojan Independent years ago that I read, and I was fascinated by, you know, Winifred's story, the fate of Gilboa, how it was tied up in, you know, both the problems of New York City's water supply system, but also the international science community, which flooded the town. I mean, you know, and they really, you know, they sort of like, whatever, anything to save the town, you know, but they didn't really understand all that stuff. So it was a convergence of very unlikely events that really captured my imagination. It was also around that time where Larry Summers and some other folks were getting hammered for talking about women's inability to do science. I mean, that was a very topical thing for quite a while until all those characters went scurrying back with their tails between their legs. But you know, there's so much written about the problem, and you know, your daughter in math class, if you remember those days, you see the problem. So our daughters. So that too, it was sort of, I was interested in that problem and trying to, you know, invoke a character that I think, you know, really puts that idea there. Yeah. So yeah, you know, I wrote an article called Factual Fiction, an essay on unlikeliness, and it's about, you know, how writers get their stories, and you know, the whole thing, Mark Twain's thing about life being stranger than fiction. Yeah, that's true, but the blend of fact and fiction, you know, finding stuff and that seemed really unusual juxtaposition, and then writing a story around it is really what I like to do. You know, I do a lot of research, and you know, you just try to imagine the interior life of all these real characters who were involved in these unlikely events, at unlikely places, in unlikely times. You know, it's the convergence of all that stuff. Really, really intriguing and motivates. My first book is like this too. If you want to, in my first book, which won a Penn Hemingway Award, it's called As It Is on Earth. And if you like New England history, this is New York, but if you like New England history, that's about a lot of sort of fictional stuff. I should also say that you know, one of the reasons I'm doing upstate New York, but I'm also doing, you know, down in Florida, and I'm going to read that part next. I like the juxtaposition of those climates and those landscapes. They really capture for me a lot of stuff. So my first book, I wrote all about, you know, Maine and the Yucatan, and how the two of them, Maine jutting out to the Atlantic and the Yucatan jutting out, you know, peninsulas, lost peninsulas, with very, very different kinds of topography and flora and fauna and history, and you really begin to understand what Caroline Merchant, landscape historian, said, you know, it's history from the ground up. You know, history really, really is such a function of the ground from which it, you know, emanated, the lands from which it emanated. Yes.
So two questions. How long did it take you to write this? And the second is, are those fossils still being go through the?
Yes, yeah, I actually was going to include a slide. If you go up, Gilboa, what happened is the town was relocated, basically. And the book talks a lot about how that relocation took place. And there was on the road to the Schoharie Reservoir, right outside, and there's a museum up there called the Gilboa Museum. You can see the fossils and you know, all the backstory. I should also say, and I'm sort of wondering if somebody in the audience is from the Gilboa Museum. I wrote the Gilboa Museum and told them that I was writing a story about Winifred Goldring, a novel about Winifred Goldring, about the fossil discovery, and they were terribly excited. No, we're going to have a big reading there and sell all your books. And I said, well, I have to warn you that it's based on Winifred, but it, you know, it's not true to her life. I mean, parts of it are very true, but you know, Winifred, for example, never had children, but she has bunch of children in our age of, you know, and her, I took a lot of liberties with the real characters, real true life characters in this book. So when the book came out, I sent them a copy, you know, thank you, and about 6 weeks later, I got a very sort of sheepish and frightened email from the director of the museum calling the whole thing off. You know, and again, it's very hard, and I totally understood. And you know, I wrote back and said, you know, you're so invested in the true history of this thing. You know, I'm a novelist, and I'm telling stories here, and I do it. You know, if you read the afterword in the book, you know, my affection for Winifred Goldring is very palpable in the story. I mean, she's the heroine of her. She does some strange stuff, but she, you know, my admiration for her is very clear. And but you know, it just they couldn't have this wild story at their museum. Yeah.
I'm sorry we were late. long drive from Gilboa.
Oh.
And, being worked on the museum and,
You did.
but, you know, they just discovered new fossils.
Yes, in Cairo, yeah, that it's no longer the oldest fossils,
Right.
yeah. Yeah, I'm very in touch with Linda Hernick, who you may or may not know, who was the collections manager in the paleontology department at the museum, and did a lot of the field work, both and wrote all the articles. She was very gracious and let me into see all the papers, and she actually sent a copy of the book to one. I'm sure you know the head of the museum, or I don't know, but one woman who did a lot of watercolors.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. She was the one who, panicked when she saw the book.
I just wanted to say that it's a live topic. They just recently figured out that tops belong to a different tree.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Mhm. Well, yes, yeah. And they're in the book too. A couple of Germans came and disputed Winifred's identification of the branchlets, the ferns. And they proved to be right. So they had to readapt the name of the tree. She was essentially right. No one could figure out for a long time what the canopy really looked like. And it turned out the canopy in her drawing of that tree was from another tree. It was from a lycopod that was buried with the stumps.
You mentioned that the people were relocated.
Yeah, well, the whole village, the taking line was above the steeple of the church. So, and it's all, the whole dramatic end to the town is in the book, and it's based on real things they had to do. People refused to leave their houses, and said, "Bring on the water, I dare you." And so there was a real standoff for a long time. There were all kinds of different. The Board of Water Supply from New York City, had a whole bunch of strategies to lure people out of their houses, or they would watch them, and somebody would go out and leave their house to get groceries, and then they would burn the house down. So it was really a very, very painful thing. And, I know a lot of people who are involved in the museum and the backstory still feel it. I mean, they really feel that drama.
I don't remember the history of the Shokan Reservoir and all the towns that had to be.
No, this was the last one. Gilboa was the last of the 11 towns that were flooded out for the New York City water supply system. This was the last reservoir for the so-called Catskill system. Okay. Oh, another question.
Sit there. And water level is very low.
Oh,
Reservoir no longer has a fall,
yeah.
and the stream is just full of rocks. There is no water passing. There is water laying there, but it doesn't pass through, and that's miles down. And that's the state of it now.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. There's a lower outlet, which they probably closed at this point, I know. Are they still fishing in there in the reservoir?
No, there's no water.
No.
There were turtles at one time and reptiles, but no more.
One of the really interesting things about that reservoir too, I found, and I write a lot about it in the book, is the Schoharie Creek, which ran through that lovely little valley I showed in the first slide. That was running kind of northeast to dump into the Mohawk River, and the dam stops it. But then they have what they call the Shandaken tunnel inlet chamber over on the west bank, and that takes the water from the reservoir, spins it 180 degrees, sends it south. That was a fascinating thing. The water's coming north and gets there and then it gets spun around and hops out there near the Esopus and heads on down to New York City. I mean, just technologically, it's fascinating how these things work. But the pathos of these poor towns. Okay, so this last bit, last reading now is the second generation. We've covered the first and the third. The doorman is the third, and Winifred is the first. And again, going back to that lineage chart, you'll see there are many more characters involved, relatives, family members in the first generation as well as the second generation. But this is about Livingston Consolver, the doorman's father, who actually the doorman never gets to meet because he's killed in World War II shortly after the doorman was born. And he doesn't know who his father is for a long part, but there are no spoilers here. I'm trying to avoid the spoilers. So this is, he's a young character. This is in 1938. And he's been raised in the Bronx, not really knowing his background. And he goes to Central Park with his sister during the Depression, during the Depression, and sees the Expeditionary Army, the so-called bonus army of World War I vets who didn't get their bonuses. And they set up all these Hoovervilles in Central Park, shanty towns right in the middle of Central Park. As a young boy, he goes there with his sister and gets on Summit Rock in Central Park and looks down and sees the Hoovervilles. And he gets very inspired by the story and he wants to do something. And so he wants to get out of the city. He's going to go and plant trees and join the Civilian Conservation Corps. So this little bit is he's just left his mother and his sister and boarded the train to Florida. 2 days later, midday, just outside of Ocala, Florida, the train slowed and came to a halting stop in a heat thicker than anything Livingston had ever experienced. The boys were unloaded into the blinding sun, blinking and shielding their eyes before a line of men in military uniforms posted at intervals along the platform. Behind each officer, a group of young men stood at loose attention, smirking and elbowing each other. Orders were barked, whistles were blown. The boys from the train separated into their companies and with duffel bags slung on their shoulders, marched down the platform to a convoy of waiting Liberty trucks idling in the summer heat. The other boys, the smirkers, were marched in the opposite direction toward the train. They began hooting and calling out wisecrack warnings. "You're in the shits now, fellas. Stay clear of Clark Gable. That whistle-crazed top kick will twist your shorts up good. Give sweet Miss Cookie a pinch on the bottom for me. Your dipshit $1 a day not gonna pay for what you got coming." More whistles, more barking, and the teasing gave way to the sound of shuffle marching feet. At the rear of the truck transport for Company 144, an officer sporting a thin clipped movie star mustache and wearing a broad flat brimmed Stetson held back the canvas flap. He stood next to a hawk-nosed, weather-beaten man with folded arms and a taciturn face, framed beneath smooth black hair combed into a gelled pompadour. The man was out of uniform. He looked local, years spent in the Florida sun. But he was the one doing the inspecting, studying each boy closely as they climbed into the back of the truck. Livingston was the last load. He hitched himself up and took a seat on the hard wooden bench lining the flatbed. The officer handed over his hold on the tarp to his partner and with a nod to him walked off. The Florida man stood before the open tailgate, still looking the boys over, then said, "That there is Officer Gable, the camp subaltern. You can call me Superintendent Sticky. I ain't no officer anymore, but you will follow my orders. I can guarantee you that. He slammed the tailgate shut with one hand, then addressing Livingston said quietly, "You're a consolver, I'm betting." "Yes, sir, I am." "City boy. Mr. Fuller says to keep you in line. That okay with you?" "Yes, sir." "And that's good." Changing his demeanor, Rembrandt Sticky broke into a wide, friendly grin and turned to the full company. "But first, let's do some sightseeing. I'm going to show you whips the Florida rocks and mocks." He clicked his teeth, then drew the flap closed. Before heading south to the camp in Sebring, the truck went west, to Silver Springs. The superintendent said he'd like to take his new boys, quote unquote, into the Florida swamp woods. Said it helped them to get acquainted, not with each other, but with the Florida swamp woods. None of them could have guessed that they'd be spending their first Florida afternoon drifting down the Silver River in a glass bottom boat at Colonel Toohey's Jungle Cruise. The colonel, whose rank, quote unquote, turned out to be his given Christian name, was a friend of Sticky's. They had served together as boys in the American Expeditionary Forces, but privates. Private Colonel Toohey had been wounded in the Battle of the Argonne Forest and dragged clear by Sticky. The patch over his left eye gave him the look of a buccaneer, which worked well for his tour boat operation. Rembrandt and Colonel had also worked the cleanup down at Isla Morada after the Hurricane 35 swept through Matacumbe Key. The Argonne had been hard, but cleaning up the death on Isla Morada had been worse. Many of their old friends from the expeditionary forces, the out-of-work men from the bonus army that Livingston had seen years before in Central Park, had been sent there by Roosevelt to build bridges between the islands of the Keys. Most of them died in that water. It didn't seem fair. In the Argonne, death made sense. It was always nearby, out in the open. But on Matacumbe Key, it had come out of nowhere, littering the white sand beaches with bloated bodies, still sparkling with silicate and dry sea salt, sun-baked eyes gone vacant, but still wide open in disbelief. After that, Colonel Toohey went to freshwater. He set up his operation in the middle of the state, as far from the coast as he could get. He was there on the Spring River, ready and waiting when Rembrandt drove in with his enrollees. These visits were welcomed by both men, mostly to affirm that they were not alone with their bad dreams. Toohey's slow-moving river ran along stands of cypress draped with dry Spanish moss. The water's edges lost among the cypress knees and the dark backshore oaks throttled by banyan stranglers. But in the channel, the water was surprisingly cool and crystal clear. Rembrandt said that was where the river got its name, the underground springs. They even made underwater pictures there, Hollywood. Before joining the CCC, if he could get away, Rembrandt would drive up from his home down in Princeton to help Toohey on the film shoots, keeping back the alligators and the crocs brought up from the lower glades. He and Toohey used their old Springfields for the water moccasins and diamondbacks. The monkeys were the worst, he said, pointing out a macaque squatting on an overhanging limb in the upper story. Don't even belong. They brought a few here for that Tarzan picture last year and they got loose. Now they're cluttering up the oaks, throwing shit at everyone. I'd shoot them out, but Toohey's making too much money off the gawkers. Rembrandt shook his head at the boatload of young chins leaning up to the high cypress canopy. Just don't belong, he said again, wistfully. That was the first time Livingston ever saw a live monkey. It was also the first time that Livingston caught a glimpse of the brooding in the dark eyes of the camp superintendent. Rembrandt spent that afternoon lecturing the young man on just what did belong in Florida. He pointed out the custard apples and the scrub willows, the heart-shaped moon vines and the slick trails of tree nails, the river otters and long-tailed weasels, snowy egrets, white ibises, and swallow-tailed kites, the chiselwinks and the dragonflies. He spoke of the endless sawgrass and palmettos that would await them further south, the ancient leather ferns and Florida arrowroot, which had been used by the Everglade Indians to make soft key, and the oak and slashed pine hammocks that barely kept the clawed toes of digging armadillos above sea level. And there were warnings too. The black bears, spike-shelled snappers, and the Florida panther, all tending to their own business, but ready to turn on the boys just for crossing paths. When one fellow asked about the Indians, about the Seminoles and the Miccosukes who lived there and hunted unseen, Rembrandt just said it was best to stay off that path as well. After the cruise, before boarding the truck, Livingston learned that Rembrandt had come from the Everglades, been born there, families generations back. He was part Indian, for the most part. Colonel Toohey quietly suggested that none of the boys better call him a Seminole to his face. Rem's a Miccosukee. Them Upper Creek Indians ain't never been conquered. Toohey winked with his good eye. They would have days ahead with one another, Livingston, Consalver, and Rembrandt Stickey. A brief lifetime, in fact. But on the ride down to Sebring, then there in the stifling late afternoon cover of oiled canvas and the sweat smell of anxious young men, Livingston thought only of the departing train he left earlier in Ocala, the pressure release of its brakes, and the silence of those on board who had come to know this place and were taking their memories away with them. For Livingston, there was no going back, not to the Bronx, not to the city, not to that world. He was going to plant trees, clear streams, restore eroded earth, and sleep in the embrace of open skies. He pulled at the damp cling of his shirt a few times, fanning his chest, cooling the smooth skin of a CC man who was in most ways still just a boy. Perhaps that was why the trouble was inevitable, that Livingston would find himself so drawn to Rembrandt Stickey's young wife, Belle. He'd not been allowed to be an innocent long enough. So that's Florida.
We want you to keep reading. That's engaging.
Well, I'm happy to keep reading, but what time is it?
6:30. 6:30. Can you say more about the tree and the fern branches? You said the fern branches belong to another tree?
Yeah, when they found the fossils in the quarry, they found the stumps. You saw the photograph of
Yeah.
the worker pulling the stump out. They also found embedded in the stone fossils that looked like ferns.
Fern.
Yeah, and she speculated
Mhm.
that, and actually they named it, I can never pronounce probably the Latin name, but she speculated that those were the branchlets
Uh-huh.
of the tree.
And how did they find out that it belonged to another tree?
Well, as I recall, there were Kraussel and Weisfeld, two German paleontologists. There's in Devon, England, is where you can also see examples from the Devonian period, and they had done a lot of research over there. Somehow or another, and I'm not a paleontologist or geologist, so I can't be sure exact about this, but they kind of put two and two together. And the fossils had actually been unearthed for the first time before Winifred Goldwyn, before the Riverside Quarry, back in 1880s. I think Samson Lockwood they fell out of the stream, but they didn't really know what they were, and they, you know, so like all things in science, you know, they say this is what it is until it's disproven, and then it is disproven later on, and then that's disproven, and so on. So it just, you know, science is, you know, profitably shape-shifting in that regard. Yes.
Your writing is very pleasantly descriptive. It's very good.
Okay.
And I'm just curious about your background in your reading. What are the books that you have enjoyed reading over the years?
Well, some of you may have picked up on the Matthiessen in my middle name, Peter Matthiessen. You know, was my uncle, and I'm named after him, and I was quite close to him. You know, and he was, if you know his writing, you can see a little bit where I get my inspiration. You know, I've always admired Peter's writing, and I mean, he's, you know, nobody writes about the natural world with such amazing style and grace as Peter Matthiessen in the judgment. So he's a big sort of Walker Percy is another one that is very important to me. His sort of sense of irony and seeing the kind of humor and quotidian things, you know. He's a big influence on me. But otherwise, I read philosophy. Richard, I'm a hardcore American pragmatist. I'm a big Earth James, Richard Rorty guy. So, and I taught this kind of stuff too when I was teaching for many years. I taught seminars on the environment and, you know, ways to think about the relationship of humankind to dirt. I was I taught at the new school, Parsons School of Design, for many years. In a previous life, I was an architect, and I was the head of this School of Architecture at Parsons for 10 years. A lot of seminars and studios, but they were always around, you know, issues of place, and how the things we make, just like history itself, emanate from the places we situate things.
I'm just a short ways into the book, and I know you will describe the events that led to the reservoir going from upstate to New York City. Are you able to give me a preview of that history? How the decisions were made, how the selections were made, and how there was even a sense that New York didn't need it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet it was put through by the politicians and what have you. So are you able to abbreviate that?
I don't know. I'll tell you what I know. I mean, and there are probably some characters here who know that history better. But you know, the original reservoir was built there. I mean, I won't go all the way back to the Collect Pond in Lower Manhattan, but in Central Park, there was a big reservoir there. It looked like a big quadrangle filled with water, and that took its water from Croton. That was the first system, the Croton system, and they did the same thing in Croton, various small towns in the Croton area to feed that, and then they began to see that they were not going to have enough water for the vast number of immigrants that were coming into the city, and so they went out looking for more. And the Catskill system was the second one, Schoharie Reservoir being the last of that line, and then the Delaware system came after that. And Yeah, it clearly New York City needed it. How decisions were made were very political, which towns were, for example, Gilboa. There was a better site than Gilboa for this reservoir, which is Prattsville. And everybody thought Prattsville was going to be the one. In fact, Board of Water Supply went there and surveyed the whole thing, and everybody thought Prattsville was going to do it. And Gilboa was just doing good. And then suddenly the surveyors started showing up in Gilboa and realized they could get a lot more water if they did there. So, and the Democrats and Republicans in the city, the Board of Water Supply, political appointments, they're all run by, I hate to say this, the elites. That's a horrible word being used. But, they were all Ivy League characters who were appointees to the Board of Water Supply. So they didn't really have they didn't have a good sense of how painful this was going to be for so many upstate characters. And that, continues to this day. I mean, the upstate downstate thing is a vestige of all of this, co-opting, eminent domain takeovers of state stuff. What are you gonna do? Turn to the two states, I guess. Yes.
Yeah, I see the straight line between your first generation and your third generation. Yeah, the reservoir, the Central Park Reservoir. I haven't read it. And now we have the second generation in Florida. You use geographical.
Yeah.
Contrast before. But what was it that motivated you besides, the geography and the difference in the climate? I mean, I sort of sense a tree thing going on between somebody who's examining trees and somebody who's not planting. But what was the thought process?
Well, not to give away too much here. Princeton plays a big part in the book. Both the university, and you will find out, well, Princeton University and Princeton, Florida. They play. Princeton, Florida actually was founded by an alumnus of Princeton University named Gaston Drake. And Gaston Drake went down and set up tree farms in Princeton, Florida. And he painted, if you know, Princeton's colors are black and orange. And the whole town, he painted black and orange in Princeton, Florida. But he was basically a horrible businessman. He was one of the ones who denuded the land. I mean, you go down to Princeton, Florida, it's red dust. I mean, it's not gold anymore, but it was pretty bad. So Princeton is sort of a big sub-scene text in this thing. And you saw from that earlier slide, the diorama, unbeknownst to Winifred Goldring, the ferns that were being used in her diorama, the Gilboa diorama, were being shipped up from Florida. Little did she know from her son, Lucy, who didn't know she was some other. So, it's trees and all these sort of elliptical, like vines, tendrils. What's that?
Yeah, well, I was convinced you made up Princeton, but Princeton, Florida, that is, it's one of those cases where the news stories actually are more unlikely.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, since you brought up the Matthiessen connection, was it daunting to take on Florida? For you at all?
In my family, the doorman is joked as, I'm doing, this is my version of not even true, but forgetting Peter's last book that won the National Book Award. It's always hard to remember it because Peter asked all of us in family for our favorite title for the book. I want to say Indian Country, but it's Forgotten Country, sorry. Shadow Country, yes. Shadow Country. So the joke is, this is I'm doing, this is my version of Shadow Country, which is, you know, a multi-generational tale based on the Edgar Watson stories. That first came out in as 3 separate books, and then coalesced into Shadow Country, which won the National Book Award.
How and when did you end up in the doorman as a narrator for the story like this?
Well, you know, in the first part I read, when I talk about, you know, being named the doorman by Dante, the young boy who plays a very big role in the book as well. The young boy calls him the doorman, but he emphasizes it as if there's a hyphen between door and man. And that the reason I was interested in the hyphen more than I was interested in the doorman. And the reason is because it was the coupling of an inorganic thing, a door, with a man. And that's what a fossil is. You know, a fossil is a piece of organic material that becomes a lithic stone. And there's a whole thing about all the different, you know, the doorman and a bunch of his other friends, the garbage man, the telephone man, you know, they all go and do Tai Chi in Central Park in Central Park. There's a whole thing about all the different statues in Central Park, and, you know, which are basically, you know, human beings in stone, right? So there's a riff about all that sort of stuff. So I wanted to be in Central Park. I wanted to find some character that could, you know, occupy that kind of hyphenated condition. And the idea of a doorman, which is essentially an invisible occupation, you know, that it's, I mean, you know, you could write many really interesting stories about doormen. They can really capture one's imagination because they are in hiding, you know, in a sense. And this doorman is very much in hiding. You know, as I said in the first reading, I talked about it being his considered choice. And you'll find out why, in fact, he's holding that position, why he's there then, what he's up to, and so forth. So, you know, I mean, you'll learn very quickly that he's a doorman by day and lives in a penthouse at a Museum Mile at night. A little teaser.
Oh, I was really interested in the way you described the way Winifred Goldring was treated by the guys. And it reminded me of the novelist George Eliot, Marianne Evans in British fiction. Oh, well, as 19th century British fiction. And how she had to assume a different name, she couldn't write under her own name, you know, the whole structure.
Yeah.
So the addendum to that is I was at Tanglewood on the 30th, and there's a woman conductor. She's just wonderful.
Yeah.
Everyone loves her. She's just fabulous.
No. I think science, so it's been particularly hard. Yeah, Kim.
First of all, it's a terrific book. So I encourage everybody to read it. It's absolutely true. What Peter says, get screwed up with the characters, don't worry about it. It does come clear in the end, absolutely. So just keep, it's really tremendous. But one of the things that was a delight was to be, you know, involved in these huge themes. It's an unbelievably ambitious book that you've written that has all the great themes in the world, like religion, science, reconcile faith and reason, and culture, you know. and you will read it all in fabulously well. But then there are these wonderful little insights that come in. And I don't even know what to call them. I might call them incidental, but they're actually not incidental. Because they take part in this huge world, but all of a sudden we're super involved in the diorama. The way that the curve. You know, and I'm, this is fantastic. It has nothing to do with anything, but all of a sudden my interest is. And throughout the whole book, there's Renaissance painting somewhere, insights into Renaissance painting, all of these fabulous subjects.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about.
Well, I mentioned Walker Percy earlier. One of the things Walker Percy said is like, you know, my meatball. It's a mantra. Said, you know, and I'm gonna bastardize it, but it is something to the effect that small disconnected facts, if you look at them very closely, all hook up.
Yeah,
They all connect.
that's great.
And that's very much the way I see what I'm up to. And that's where research and into what's really happening in the world helps. Because you find these, if you really dive deep into certain, you know, things, you begin to discover all these very ancillary things, like, you know, 7 degrees of separation or whatever. Everything actually, you know, you can track it all the way back and they hook up, and then you find a way to bring that forward into the story. My first book is the same way. I mean, it's you know, it's a lot of what seem like incidentals. That's a really nice way to put it. Because they are, in a funny way, they're caesuras, I guess you could also say, where, you know, things sort of stop for a moment and you get way in, you're looking at this detail and you see it's a story within the story. But then it pops out and it's right back where it should be, you know, and it's not as if you've gone off into a different tale. That's you know, that's the pleasure of the text.
Yes,
That's
it's
what
a great-
writing was really nice.
It's
Really,
perfect.
you know.
Did you ever read Overstory?
Yeah.
Did you finish did you read Overstory?
You know, I did. I didn't finish it. To be honest with you, my wife and I did the audio version on a cross-country trip or something, and I liked it, but it's funny. It's a fabulous book. He's a fabulous writer, and I was very pleased. One of the critics of this book, Richard Powers. You like Richard Powers? Read this book. You know, so I'm totally supportive. But you know, when you've been wrapping your head around trees for as long as I have in this book, it's just, you know, it's very distracting. So I can't read it as a fresh reader. You know, it's one of those things. Maybe one day I'll get to it. Yeah.
Quick question, you could think one at a time. I'm only interested in the writing process.
The writing process.
Yeah, but you do, and maybe add on to that is. It's fascinating that you're an architect, or an architect and a writer, and then it's on both sides of the brain. So did you have to do a lot to get your writing skills up to far as trying to be as well? And the third one was.
So did I miss the first one? I thought.
The first one was just your writing process.
Up front, the writing process, and then the relationship between architecture and writing.
Right, and then the third one was, I imagine this sparks a lot of conversations on the water situation now in the world, you know, lack of water.
Yeah.
Clean water, you know, the lack of fresh water versus salt water. Has
Climate
been getting
change, yeah.
into a lot of conversations with scientists So any or all of them.
Yeah, well, let me do, I'll do the middle one first, because, and, you know, I get asked a lot. I mean, I practiced as an architect for, you know, many years, and what was involved in architectural academics for many years. So when I started writing fiction, which I actually was doing while I was being an architect, but you know, we're sort of like, we get off track, but I'll come back to it. There's a fabulous New Yorker cartoon of an older guy walking along the sidewalk, and he runs into another older fellow, and they go, "Hey, Ralph, how are you doing?" "Oh, I'm great. What are you up to?" And the other guy says, "I'm writing a novel." And the other guy says, "I'm not either." That's what it felt like, you know, here I'm not an architect, and I'm secretly that I write a novel, not telling anybody, you know, because they're all gonna roll their eyes and so on. But I had always been interested in reading, and I actually wrote a lot in college, you know, we wrote poetry and stuff, and I did a lot of academic writing, which I found ultimately in the end very dissatisfying. You know, it's sort of the difference between writing to instruct versus writing to inspire, which is a great Rorty notion, why he moved away from, you know, teaching and went into romantic literature for philosophy. But you know, that he believes social change is more easily effected by writing to inspire rather than telling people this is what's going on and instructing and stuff. So, but I will say, you know, people ask me, "Is your book about architecture?" But you know, you're an architect, and no, neither of my books are about architecture. But I know my architecture friends here see the architecture in my book. And part of it has to do, you know, and I've written about this, you know, in truth, architecture, practicing architecture couldn't train one better for writing in a lot of ways. Because a lot of the tropes in creative writing class are the same tropes we use in teaching architecture students. You know, what is the structure of the book? How do you get into it? How do you move through the book? You know, all these kinds of ideas. And so there is that kind of similarity between, you know, the way we think about making an architecture versus making a book, a novel. But there's also the loneliness of the architectural practice. Less lonely these days, but you know, in my generation, it was sort of solo practitioners. You know, you spend a lot of time all by yourself. You have a firm, you've got your people who are working for you, but you're spending a lot of time alone. You go over a drawing board, and you know, and you're basically telling a story with your design work. You know, every project has a story, which is what you use to tell your clients, you know, to get them to buy in. So the relationship between the two felt very, very seamless to me. As far as my process goes, I write every day, try to, and I guess one of the ways I think about how I write is similar to. I use this analogy of the Bureau of Land Management out west, which allows you to put 500 head of cattle up in the forest for the winter. And then at the end, in the spring, you gotta get them all down, and you gotta get them through a 12-foot wide gate into the ground. That's what writing is like. You know, you start writing. John Irving made this comment, which I love too, which is somebody asked him, how do you write a book? How do you write books? And he said, I know what the last line is, and I write toward it. And that's a lot of what it's like. And my cattle analogy is you're writing, and there are more and more cattle getting way out there in the forest. They're all out there. And at the end of the day, you've got to tell the story, which is to corral them again through 12-foot wide gate. So that's the trick. I mean, I think that's the trick in telling a good story is that, you know, cast your net wide out there, and for those who are not faint apart, read it, and they'll see at the end it all comes together. I know there are people who have tried to read this book and couldn't. You know, it was just, for whatever reason. So what was the third question? Oh, yeah. Well, this is a thinly veiled story, basically about appreciating the earth and seeing how fragile it is, seeing how, if you really look back, you know, I made that comment, every ending had its beginning, it's a matter of how far you go back to find it. Well, if you go all the way back to, you know, the Panthelastic Sea or the Catskill Sea, you know, suddenly where we're sitting is actually down below the equator. You know, so the world is a dynamic, the earth is a dynamic condition when you look at it over in the scale of deep time. And if we can really appreciate that, it makes you a little more, I hope, you know, humble about what we do with our very brief time here. In the last chapter of the book confronts this directly, because actually the last chapter of the book takes place in 2013. But yeah, I'm trying to make a point about the wheeling of the spheres. Yes.
I'm curious what really triggered you to begin writing?
What
was the trigger?
the trigger?
That you started writing a book. If there were.
You know, it really did come from, gee, my wife probably could answer this better than I can. I have an imagination. And I'm very interested in looking at the world we live in from kind of unexpected places or from not normative places. And I wrote about that in my academic stuff. I would write about, I don't know, my seminars, my theory seminars. I would sort of talk about these things just to try and get students to sit back and be more reflective about the stuff that's right in front of them. You know, they really have a kind of depth that you know, we're all so busy we have difficulty seeing. I've always been drawn to that, depth. And when I got to this place, and I think Richard Rorty was really instrumental. The American philosopher, the late American philosopher, was very important to me when I began to read all of his work, and his idea that social change can be affected more fruitfully by inspiration, by telling stories, by you know, working with the facts in kind of poetic and fictional sorts of ways. And you know, I had this story in my head for my first book that had been kicking around for a long time. And when I stepped down as the head of the School of Architecture, I took a 1.5 year sabbatical and I wrote my first book. And I haven't looked back.